Good morning, everyone. We'll get started. Thank you all for being with us today in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium of the two Mississippi Museums. I am Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones, and we'll work on that ring. If you can't brag on yourself, who can you brag on? The Jackson Convention and Visitors Bureau recognized both the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum and our History is Lunch series last week at their Hometown Hero and Summit Awards. Thank you all for coming and being a part of this on a regular basis. We will not have it next week because that's Independence Day. The museums will be closed in commemoration of the 4th, but I hope that you will all be able to join us back here on July 11th when Brian Foster, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi, will talk about the state's live blues circuit with his program, That's for the White Folks, Race, Culture, and Unmaking Place in the Rural South. Today, though, we are delighted to have Stephanie Rolph with us to present the Citizens Council in 3 movements. Rolph is Associate Professor of History at Millsaps College, where she was also an undergraduate student. She earned her MA and PhD from Mississippi State University, specializing in the history of the South. Rolph is Academic Director for the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty, a national coalition of colleges and universities committed to poverty-related coursework and internships. Her work has appeared in The Right Side of the 60s and the Journal of Southern History, and her first book, Resisting Equality, The Citizens Council, 1954 to 1989, has just been published by Louisiana State University Press. You'll be able to buy copies of it over here immediately after today's program. Help me welcome Stephanie Rolph.
Good afternoon. I am so excited to see so many familiar faces out there today. And I was telling a few people earlier, this is the first official book event that I've done. And that makes a lot of sense to me because I've spent hours in the Winter Building, in the Capers Building, long before they had broken ground on the 2 new museums. So this is a treat on many levels for me today to be here. So thank you very much for coming. When I give these talks, I always try to take a minute to recognize what enables this kind of work to be done. And for me, this particular project spanned a lot of different archives across the state and across the South, especially here at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And in the book, the acknowledgments are pretty specific about people who helped me and encouraged me along the way, especially when I was kind of in the thick of it, not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. When I first got involved with this project, I was a graduate student at Mississippi State, and when I started graduate school there, I was determined as a native Mississippian that I was not going to do Mississippi history, that I wasn't even going to do Southern history. So I spent a few years kind of spinning my wheels on legal history because I had been pre-law when I was at Millsaps as an undergraduate. And I had a conversation with a close advisor of mine one day. We were in his office, and we were just talking about some different texts that I had read, different movements in American history, and thinking about what happens to movements when they lose. And one of the things that came to mind for me was, what about these segregationists? What happened to them when they lost? I have lots of complicated answers for that now, and I would never ask that actual question today because I'm not convinced they lost. But as a graduate student, this seems pretty black and white to me. And we were talking about, just sort of like thinking about other examples over the course of American history where resistance seems pretty pronounced at a particular moment. And then if you fast forward maybe 30 years into the future, you can't really detect it. And when I first became interested in the project, it was the Citizens Council that kind of got my attention. I wanted to know what happened to these guys. because in my mind, they had lost, and they had put so much time and money, committed their careers to this. At that point, I didn't realize that the organization didn't officially disband until 1989. 1989. And I was born in 1977, so this was crazy to me. And I realized that Mississippi State had this collection of a radio program that the Forum put on for 9 years. And it was called Forum. And Mississippi State had them on these 9mm reels. They had never been transcribed, and I had no idea what was on them. The only thing that was there was an index on index cards, who the guest was and what the topic was. I started flipping through those index cards in the archive in Starkville, and I was seeing names like Barry Goldwater, George Wallace. I was seeing congressmen and senators from Idaho, Montana, California. The prime minister for Rhodesia, Ian Smith, was a guest on multiple programs. There was a series of programs that the council did in Southern Africa in 1966. And I thought, okay, maybe I could do a little Southern history. So I spent about 1.5 years with headphones on and with an archivist's help. Maddie Sink at the time, she's now Maddie Abraham, and retired. I'm sure I had nothing to do with that. But she patiently loaded those films on every day and took them off and loaded another because they were so fragile that I couldn't do it myself. I wasn't trained to do it. But they were anxious to get them transcribed because nobody had done them. And that became my dissertation. But I use that story as a way to just honor the tireless work of archivists and their curiosity and excitement over our projects. I tell students this all the time, at Millsaps when I ask them to come over to the archives, and they're intimidated because they feel like these are things they're not supposed to be touching. They're not allowed to be here. They're not official enough to be here. And I remind them that archivists are doing what they're doing because they care about the work. They care about those collections that nobody has really taken a good look at. And for me, the Citizens Council Forum Reels, which ended up being over 400 programs, many of which were very thick Southern accents, and I couldn't rewind them because they would snap. So I think I probably should be I should probably have my court reporter license too. I got really good at it, but as a native Mississippian with a thick accent of my own, some of those guys were very difficult to translate. But archival work is so important, and I hope that for those of you who have done your own research, I'm sure that you have your own great stories about your favorite archivists, and I always tell students, find your favorite archivist, have them adopt you, give them a lead on what you're looking for, and when something comes up or they remember something, they will let you know. And you can discover some pretty incredible things that way. So a lot of this research happened at MDAH. A lot of it happened at Mississippi State. I did a lot of research in the Eastland papers at the McLean Library in Oxford. I was at USM. I recently just came back from University of Kansas, where there's quite a bit of Citizens Council information. I'm done with this project, though, but I did happen to come across some of that. Stanford University as well, and so this is kind of a collection of years' worth of looking in different places, hidden places for where the council showed up. So just out of curiosity, how many of you know or have heard something about the Citizens Council? Wow. My husband especially, my mother, my son have heard a lot about this. So just wave. These are my proto-experts. So I don't really have to give you, a deep look at what these guys were known for. And that's good because the book is not about what their reputation has been. The approach that I took after doing quite a bit of research was that, oh gosh, these guys did a lot more than what historians have written about them. And in many ways, what I found was the longer term work that they did, accounting for the 64 to 89 period, was much more insidious. And it left deeper footprints than some of the harassment that we're more familiar with. They transformed institutions with their ideology, with their cultivation of new language, and the way that they infiltrated otherwise respectable organizations and positions in political ideology especially. And so when I got into the project and I first started with those forum films, my idea was, and I just love telling research stories because I want to make sure that I affirm our processes as historians, which is that we have no idea what we're going to find. Now, I'm not going to say that we don't think we know. Oftentimes, we're pretty sure we have it squared away until we start flipping through those pages or listening to films. And then we have to completely recalibrate the way we're thinking about something. I went into those forum broadcasts thinking, okay, so these guys started out as overt racist, but as I'm seeing them move through the years, and forum was on from the end of 1957, it first broadcast on WLBT, until 1966, when its host, Dick Morphew, was killed in a car accident coming back from an interview that he did with George and Lurleen Wallace in Alabama. So when Dick Morphew was killed in that car accident, Forum stopped production at that point. But it was about 9 years worth of broadcast. And so over the course of that time, the civil rights movement was just getting started. It peaked. Significant legislation passed with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then you start to see, this embrace of non-civil rights related issues on forum. Because at that point, they, again, in my mind, had lost. And so I was kind of curious about what they were talking about. In the beginning of the project, when it was in the dissertation stage, I was just looking at forum. I didn't do anything bigger than that. And my initial idea was that these guys started out as overt racist, and then they softened their language, and they became more attached to conservative ideology in the way that they talked about it. They called themselves conservatives. That's not untrue, but it was only the tip of the iceberg for me. When I was talking to LSU about contracting the book, my editor, David Goldfield, who saved the book in a lot of ways from my initial ideas, he asked me to just go ahead and do a whole history of the council. Don't just focus on forum. And I thought, I really just want to get this thing out. But I needed a contract. So I agreed to do that, and I spent about 3 more years doing other research on other things besides forum. When I looked at the long-term picture, what I realized was that the council never softened its language. It was always overtly attached to white supremacist language. They allied with conservatives. And even more interesting to me, conservatives allied with them. There was something that the council offered that was appealing to a nascent Republican movement in the American South. So for those of you who know your Mississippi history, know your Southern history, since Reconstruction, the South had been solidly Democratic, right? With the ascension of the Kennedy administration and then the Great Society programs that accompanied Lyndon Johnson's administration, Southerners began to feel more and more disenchanted with their place in the Democratic Party. Now, they weren't yet Republican, and Chris Danielson talks about this quite a bit in his book on Mississippi politics, but it was a little bit of a gradual shift for them, and the Republican Party had to court white Mississippians pretty hard in order to win them over. The council was critical to that switch. The council was not overtly political. They never endorsed anyone, any particular candidate. Now, you might sort of chuckle to yourself. They were doing lots of things behind the scenes. And I have a picture of Ross Barnett up here for a reason. He was their boy. He was their guy. Paul Johnson, who followed the Barnett administration, not so much, a little bit, but certainly J.P. Coleman, who preceded Barnett, couldn't stand the council, thought it was a very, very dangerous movement. So the council's place in the political sphere is complicated, and it depends on what year you're talking about. By the 1970s, I think it's pretty safe to say in Mississippi, the council was anathema. They were not active in Mississippi politics overtly because they had lost in the minds of many politicians, particularly John Bell Williams, for example, really had to distance himself from the council. So your knowledge of the council, I think, will be helpful as we kind of ask some larger questions today about what the project was about. So that's sort of the background on how I got interested in this. And I was, I went through a lot of different paths, a lot of different arguments, a lot of different thesis statements about what the project was going to be about, because as I found more stuff, it became more complicated. Now, you can't have an infinite project, right? You can't have an infinite book. So at some point, I had to call it. I needed to get tenure. That's important. And, a lot of it, I think, had to do with me having enough to say that we need to understand the Citizens Council within its context. So rather than looking at the council on its own merits and looking at what it did in Mississippi from 54 to 64, we need to look at bigger pictures to find out who was supporting the council until 1989. If membership lists were declining after 1962 or 1964, how did the council stay afloat until 1989? And most shocking to me was, how did it build a brand new building in 1967 on East Griffith Street? A state-of-the-art modern facility with its own archive, with multiple secretaries, early computers, all sorts of sort of cutting-edge stuff. How did they do that? The argument has been among historians that the council was basically dead by 1964. And this book argues otherwise. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who the council's allies were from 54 until 89. Those allies changed. And a lot of the money that the council is able to pull together comes from national sources as well as international sources. And all of that really rests on a common interest in propping up white supremacy. That's a pretty raw term. I think it's probably coming more into, I don't want to say fashion, but I think we're using white supremacy more than we used to. I remember one of the first places that I presented my research on the council was in Atlanta, Georgia, at a big national conference. And I was saying white power, I was saying white influence, things like that. And there was a scholar who was in the audience who during the discussion period stood up and he said, "I'm wondering why you're not using the term white supremacy." And it really set me back on my heels. And I took it seriously. We talked afterwards, and I began to really sort of transform a lot of my perspective on this. The council was very clear. If these guys were here today, they were very clear about the fact that they believed in innate racial difference, not just difference, but hierarchy. And so they were very clear about that. And as we look for their allies, we have to understand that their allies knew exactly who the council was, and they helped them out. They gave them money, they sent them places, they exchanged mailing lists with each other. And so this was kind of, this was what was really curious to me about this organization. Because historians have often written about the council as an organization that worked on the local level to intimidate Black civil rights activists and white moderates. And I certainly underscore that case in the book. I do not dispute that at all. The council worked on the local level, and they were able to really trigger their influence as a way to economically intimidate people who were putting their names on school desegregation petitions, any sort of membership in the NAACP or activity in related organizations, if you were a Black Mississippian or if you were a white moderate in Mississippi and you were not overtly in favor of the Citizens Council in its defense of segregation, then you were going to be approached by someone. And certainly the council had they had a huge role in this. And in some ways, the book opens with this story from a lady in Florida where there was also a Citizens Council movement. And one of the quotes that she uses is that Neil McMillan, who wrote the definitive work on the council back in 71, had written her a letter, this is in the USM archives, basically just asking her if she would share some of her experiences with the council. This is probably 69 maybe, and it was in Central Florida. And he had asked her if she would be willing to do an interview. And she wrote him back and she said, the council movement is not visible in Florida right now. It's active, but we kind of have to work behind the scenes. And one of the things that she said is that she would be uncomfortable doing a phone interview or being recorded, but she said, I will talk to you face to face. And she says, there are many things about the council that can't be made public. And I think that I say that as an asterisk on my work here because there's no way that I can tell you what actually happened in local places. What happened on the ground, what happened on people's front porches, what happened when, with firings and things like that, because there's no record for that. Medgar Evers wrote about this. Ruby Hurley wrote about it. Lots of other NAACP activists throughout Mississippi write about the growth of the Citizens Council and the requisite effect that it had on civil rights activity in the late 1950s. I believe that. I don't contest that. But that sort of work came to an end at a certain point, and they reached out into other spaces, and they decided where they could put permanent roots. And so that's kind of what I'm tracking throughout the book. So the images that I have up here just give you like a little bit of a sense of the different things they were involved in. All of these images are coming from archives. That one right there with George Wallace, he's speaking at a leadership conference, right as he's running for president in 1968. And he's at a Citizens Council leadership conference there. That came from the that came from the Alabama archive. That image in the corner is the Citizens Council logo, and curled around the top of it, it says states' rights, racial integrity. They used this on all of their stationery until they disbanded in 1989. So, they were very clear about that. Ross Barnett, of course, an early Citizens Council member and governor when the University of Mississippi was desegregated. The council was largely involved with influencing him on the way that he handled that. Citizens Council Forum, of course, we've talked about this, and this is the new building that they finished in 67. Now, that building is not on East Griffith anymore. My mother used to work on that street when she worked for the state. It's now a parking garage. So, I don't know how I feel about that. It's a little, poetic to me in some ways. But and then they were very active in supporting and working directly with the white minority regime in South Africa in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So they were working directly with government officials in South Africa when the United States began to turn its gaze towards sanctions against South Africa and their apartheid regime. So the council was involved with South Africa from, I think the earliest foreign broadcast I have is 1960. So before it became fashionable, the council wanted to prop up white minority regimes in Southern Africa. And there's lots of things to say about that. So this is just a little timeline of organization, just to situate you a little bit. Brown versus Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court decision that declared separate but equal to be unconstitutional and overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. It's decided in May of 1954. The first Citizens Council forms on July 11th of that same year in Indianola, Mississippi. A group of local officials, Robert Patterson is kind of in the midst of this. If you're familiar with Tom Brady's Black Monday, where he sort of puts together this manifesto of sorts for white folks in the South and how to resist the decision, was an inspiration for Tut Patterson to organize this first meeting and to begin to pursue an organized strategy for resisting federal compulsion to do this. Oh, excuse me. Oh, that won't work. So when the Association of Citizens Council of Mississippi forms in October of 1954, and that is really as a result of multiple chapters growing throughout the state. And that association is meant to sort of give them a bit of a clearinghouse so that they can organize together. They're very clear, the ACCM is very clear about the fact that they don't intend to supervise local activities because they believe in the doctrine of state sovereignty and they want to carry that down to the local area. They believe that local influence is incredibly important. Of course, what this does is it distances them from any kind of violence that might happen at the local level. The association can say, well, we don't get involved in local matters, and so we can't really confirm or deny how active the council was in these intimidations. And in fact, in 55, 56, there's a wave of violence that sort of washes over Mississippi. That is directed towards black activists like Herbert Lee, for example. And so this is sort of the state organization. The state organization is really mostly active in the late 50s. It eventually is going to be, as chapters begin to die out and membership lists begin to wither a little bit, it is the Citizens Council of America that will be the one that is kind of directing most of the activities that happen. And the reason that I mark the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission is there's a lot of confusion sometimes about what the difference was between the council and the Sovereignty Commission. They weren't friends. In fact, they at many times went after each other for a variety of reasons. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the State Sovereignty Commission was a state-funded agency that was purportedly founded in March 1956 under Coleman's administration. It was purportedly founded to raise the profile of Mississippi and to provide good publicity for the state. As it's finding, Mississippi gets a lot of bad press after Emmett Till, warranted, after the Emmett Till murder, and then after the wave of murders that happened in 56. And the Sovereignty Commission has this idea that what it will do is it will commission ambassadors to go across the country and sell the South's defense, to explain, oh, this isn't about race. We're defending segregation because this is an American principle of state sovereignty. And so the State Sovereignty Commission initially is founded for publicity purposes. We know the State Sovereignty Commission as a surveillance agency, and it does most of its work in that field of surveillance. And so they have agents, and I encourage you, if you haven't already looked at this, pull up those online files through MDAH, search people's names, people that you know, people that you remember, or just people that you're aware of, like Medgar Evers. You'll see a stack of files, and you could read the original documents that had been digitized. But the State Sovereignty Commission hired agents, essentially, to watch the comings and goings of various civil rights activists in the state, as well as white people that they had suspicions about. So if you weren't active enough in defending segregation, you were suspicious. You were someone that needed to be watched. The worst figure for a lot of these activists, and I mean the white activists who were against the civil rights movement, were white moderates. They couldn't trust them. They weren't committed enough in their mind to defend segregation at all costs. This is why the council disliked J.P. Coleman so much, that he was too reasonable for them. He wasn't willing to stand in the schoolhouse door, and he was very clear about that. Ross Barnett was. But the State Sovereignty Commission fought with the council quite a bit on resources because they were getting state funding. The council was not, but they tried to. And they were doing very similar things. So the council had folks on the ground who were doing surveillance, and the council also had a very well-developed, highly sophisticated media strategy. They were, in fact, doing visits to places like Council Bluffs, Iowa. They were going to California. They were taking out ads in New York. And so they were doing similar work. The difference was that the Sovereignty Commission was getting state funding for it, and the council was not. And initially, when the Sovereignty Commission was founded, my argument is that the council was for it because they thought it would be a handmaiden. And the personalities just didn't match up once that took off. And Coleman was governor when this happened. And he was not a fan of the council, so he really wanted to separate their activities as much as possible. I think it's fair to say that Coleman was hoping that the Sovereignty Commission would replace the council movement. Because you can control a state agency, right? You can't control the council. And so I think his hope was that this would supplant the council movement. It didn't. And there was a lot of infighting that happened when Ross Barnett came in. The Sovereignty Commission, under Barnett's administration, funneled money to support Forum. And so while the council didn't have a line item in the budget, the money was going through the Sovereignty Commission, and the Sovereignty Commission funded Forum for several years, until its director, Earl Johnston, who some of you may be familiar with, put a stop to that because he made the argument and did quite a bit of research that the council's claims about how far-reaching Forum were false. And he wrote all kinds of letters to radio stations and television stations across the country to see if they were covering Forum or carrying it. The council was claiming it was, and in fact, the image that I showed you that had the Forum clip on it was the title for a list of stations that were featuring Forum. They would carry that in their newsletter every month. And Johnston, who was the head of the Sovereignty Commission, didn't believe that. He wrote to those stations and he said, "Are you carrying this?" And many of them wrote back and said, "Never heard of it." So he used that as a way to defund the council. At that point, the council is broadcasting in D.C. at congressional studios there. And that costs quite a bit of money. And so they have to find other funding sources. So I would say, that was 62 that you begin to see some infighting between Johnston and Bill Simmons. How many of you did any of you know Bill Simmons? He was sort of the definitive leader of the Citizens Council of America. It's funny to me because his obituary, which I think was self-written, I think he wrote it, said that he had spent over 30 years working for the council, but in his obituary, it says he spent his entire career doing educational work. The only thing he ever did was council work. Before that, he had failed in business and that sort of thing. His family owned the Fairview Inn, which is, of course, active now. So he was largely responsible for their publicity campaigns. But the Citizens Council of America is what I spend most of the book talking about. I don't have a lot of information on local chapters. The Citizens Council of America had a long and deep set of archival materials and paperwork that I was able to discover in various places. But local chapters are difficult to find because a lot of their activities wouldn't have been recorded, which is scary. And so I can't really pin a lot of that down. We rely on memories and oral histories and things like that for that. The Citizens Council of America was the organization that persisted until 1989, and they supervised the publicity program, and they supervised the radio broadcast and all of the newsletters that went out. This organization was widely committed to propaganda. They sent out newsletters. They exchanged mailing lists with lots of different organizations. And some of them were pretty middle-of-the-road conservative. Some of them were white nationalist groups. So they were a big tent. The Citizens Council was a big tent organization. Before we used that to describe the Republican Party, the Citizens Council was not picky about who they would ally with. And so they were able to really begin that when they moved Forum from the WLBT studios to Washington, D.C. in 1958. It stayed there until 1966, and they used the recording privileges of people like Don Bell Williams and Jim Eastland to record there, and most of their guests were congressmen and senators because they were right there. But D.C. also was a great clearinghouse for visiting dignitaries and other folks who were interested in supporting a particular issue and, getting free press for it. So sometimes you would come across in the Forum broadcast people who were on there talking about water rights, which to me was a snooze fest. I wanted the good stuff. But eventually I thought, oh no, this is it. This is what they're doing. They're just building relationships with people that I think are boring, but that give them a wider network to pull from in the long term. And it worked like crazy. They were able to pull all kinds of funding by the end of, by the time the civil rights movement had seen some of its best successes in 64 and 65, the council had already moved on to other issues. They were done with civil rights, at least the organized resistance to civil rights. They fully committed after 64 and 65 to propping up white supremacy in a variety of ways. And so that move to D.C., I think, was really critical in helping them make that transition. So a lot of the book does have to do with the Citizens Council of America and its various activities. But as I wrap up, because I'm really curious to hear your stories and your insights into this organization, what you know about it. But as I wrap up, I do want to spend just a second talking about what exactly they were doing after 64 and 65. And I mentioned Southern Africa. They spent quite a bit of time in that renegade regime in what is now Zimbabwe. It was Rhodesia. And it had been a protectorate of the British government for a long time. As decolonization happens, the black majority in Rhodesia begins to follow the suit of a number of other nations throughout Africa, and they want to participate in their government. They want to lead their government. And Rhodesia is, a great target for the council. Rhodesia has been sanctioned by the United Nations by 1965, 1966. It happens again, and then again in 1967. The council, as many white Southerners and conservatives believed, was anti-United Nations. The sanctions came from the UN. And it was a white minority regime. And so this was a perfect issue for the council to be involved in. The council exchanged information with leaders in Rhodesia and in South Africa. South Africa is a different case, but in both cases, they were allying with leaders and people who were in positions of influence in the government to sell those countries to Americans. So I just got back from, looking at a lot of tourism brochures that I found at University of Kansas that were written to encourage white Americans to come visit Rhodesia in South Africa in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, this is not a time that you want to be touring Rhodesia in South Africa. But the pictures are of white ladies with a fashionable hat and a cute suit. Lots of pictures of debutantes coming out in Rhodesia. What they were trying to do was they were trying to say, we're like you. And we know what you've been through. Don't make us go through it too. And so the council was a perfect conduit, for transferring this information back and forth. So they were printing stuff in their own materials, and then they would print materials in South African publications and in Rhodesian publications. They encouraged people to immigrate to Rhodesia so that maybe we could get closer to a majority. And they were also, of course, as you may know, deeply involved in establishing, and I make the argument that this is probably the deepest imprint that the council made. And it was in the private school system that Mississippi is so infamous for. The council was the first organization to set up private schools. The first private school it set up was in 1964. White moderates were sort of disenchanted with the council by then, but when Mississippi had to desegregate in 69 and 70, the council became popular again. This is what Bill Simmons says about it. This is in an oral history he did that's housed at MDAH. Bill Simmons said, and he did this interview probably in 80, I think. He said, none of those white moderates wanted to have anything to do with us after the Meredith desegregation. But as soon as the schools began desegregating, we couldn't enroll their children fast enough. And he saw this, and Medford Evans, one of the other leaders of the council movement, said the same thing. He saw this as the ultimate council victory. So where I would have come in and said early on, oh no, you lost that. Simmons' obituary talks about his educational work. Medford Evans says in 1986, we didn't lose. Look at the suburbanization of Mississippi, the growth of places like Madison County and Rankin County, the growth of the private school movement, and the Republican shift. And this is what he says. He says, talking about white people in Mississippi, they didn't accept it. They ran from it. So in his mind, talking about the civil rights movement, in his mind, the council won because they just found a new way to protect their whiteness and the privileges that came with that. And so the private school system that the council started out with was something that a lot of local places throughout Mississippi followed and mimicked. And we can see the complications of this today, right? So when we think about that post-64 period, the investment in Southern Africa, the propping up of white minority regimes there, the establishment of the private school movement, and the council's investment in Wallace's 68 and 72 campaign for president were the things that I found most troubling, because all of those things turned into something. And that way, the council found all sorts of ways to kind of reach in and do other work once they had lost the formal battles that we normally associate with them. So I hope that has given you a little insight into what the book is about. And that, it does make some arguments that, we should think about these guys beginning to end as doing something other than the traditional forms of resistance. The council's eye was always on national influence. And I'll finish with this. The only president that the council ever endorsed after the election, any guesses? Reagan. They couldn't stand Nixon. They had no time for Carter. Reagan was a victory for them. In fact, he made the cover of the Citizens Council journal, The Citizen, shortly after the election. They saw Reagan as finally someone who will represent our interests. That's as close to contemporary politics as I'm going to get. So, Chris, I'm ready. I hope that you will feel free to offer comments as well as questions.
I was wondering if you found anything out about Hoxie, Arkansas, which is this little tiny town in 1955 desegregated without any problems. Everybody thought it was a great idea until the White Council, the Citizens Council, got involved, and I understood that more or less allowed them to grow.
No, I think this is a good point, and one of the things that I try to do throughout the book is I try to sort of step out and say, okay, what's happening in council movements across the South? Like, how is Mississippi different? Mississippi was the most successful, but one of the things that George Lewis writes about in Massive Resistance, Hoxie is one of his examples. Faubus, who was governor when the Little Rock crisis happened, was a moderate. You know, those terrible white moderates. He was a moderate when he started out, but quickly defensive segregation became a political issue and how you would get elected. And so Faubus sort of shifted his position, and Hoxie is a good example of how the presence of a citizens council could get people stirred up enough to sort of shift their position for a number of reasons. But one of the things that strikes me is that, you know, you didn't want to be, if you were a white person, and you were maybe not thrilled about desegregation, but you didn't want to, you know, necessarily be active against it, they would have considered you a white moderate. And so the council's presence in a place like Hoxie was important in going to those guys and saying, you don't want to be associated with the civil rights movement because it's communist. And so you need to be more overtly supportive of protecting desegregation. So I think it's an excellent point, especially in different places in the South where the council was present. Its presence often reflected either a vacuum of leadership, which is what it was in Mississippi when it was born, or an alternative to leadership that more vigorous resistors wanted to combat. Oh, I'm sorry.
The legacy of white supremacists, which was advocated by the Citizen Council of America, you said that one of the things that they left Mississippi and one of the things that may be a victory for them is the private school. Now that we have federal funding going into the private schools, and many of the private schools are now integrated, do you change your opinion, or do you hold that opinion today?
It doesn't change my opinion, and here's why. What the private school movement did, even if the racial makeup looks different today, the private school movement offered alternative education. And the reason why that's so dangerous, I didn't know would be so relevant to where we are today. When you curate your curriculum, then you're creating generations of perspectives that aren't necessarily rooted in the rigors of education. And I say that, you know, because I'm a graduate of one of these schools, and this was something that was happening not just in the South, but this was nationwide in the late 60s. A number of schools were being created as a way to create a more narrow space for children to be educated so they wouldn't be exposed to dangerous ideas like feminism, like civil rights, racial equalitarianism, those sorts of things. And so it's not just about race today, even though it started out that way, and I think this is an excellent point to make. The danger of private education in the way that it was construed, especially in a place like Mississippi, is that you can teach whatever you want, and you can really sort of limit what children are exposed to. And then I'm not applying this to all private schools, but this was certainly what the motivation was in the late 60s in places like Virginia, North Carolina, Baltimore, Maryland, where they decide they're going to shelter, and this is a lot of the language they use. We want to shelter our children from the elements that are out there. And that work perpetuates itself generation after generation after generation. when we talk about fake news today, I mean, this is part of it. It's part of it, but I'm not going to talk about politics today.
Thank you. And I'd like, as you, to stay away from current politics, but I'm a relatively recent, 10 years, resident of Mississippi. And I've heard a statement from several people in regards to private education that Jackson Prep began in the basement of First Presbyterian Church. I wanted to teach as a way of giving back. And so I asked for applications to be a teacher, having gotten a Mississippi credential. And every application that I encountered, including Mississippi College of Law, asked the applicant to describe his or her most intimate relationship with Jesus Christ that had occurred within the past 12 months, and generally asked for the name of the church you attended and recommendations from the pastor or the vestry or whatever. I think this ties in with your notion of curated education. And it's a curation of the educators. But my question is, to what extent did your research find, or did you in your research find any sort of statistical linkage between religiosity and the private school movement, in addition to, obviously, the aversion to racial integration? Thank you.
I would recommend Charles Bolton's book, The Hardest Deal of All, to you, because he looks at the Mississippi educational system, especially the transition into private schooling. So first I want to acknowledge Chuck Bolton's work on that and encourage you to get that book in the bookstore. May have it here. But the council schools had some religious frameworks to them. The council itself was not religiously affiliated. And I would say, as opposed to some of the other groups that organized around this time, they were pretty secular. They were much more oriented towards politics than they were towards religion. Now, with that being said, what you have to understand about the council is that they had people everywhere. So there were council members at Galloway. There were council members at First Baptist Jackson. There were council members at First Pres. And so one of the things that I can't track accurately is how much influence council members have in other spaces of influence. So if these guys are also members of Rotary clubs or Lions clubs, or they're part of the Downtown Jackson Partnership, I can't account for them as council members, but I have to believe that their council membership influences what they're doing in these other organizations. I would use that same approach to answer your question, which is, just looking at the boards, the founders of these schools, and finding out how I didn't look as much at the religious influence of the council schools. But certainly there were schools who were founded on religious principles that were not council schools. But that wasn't the norm for the Citizens Council. They did integrate it in there because they were upset about Ingle v. Vitale, which was the school prayer decision that came out in '62, I believe. They were also upset about that, but they were, I think, more upset about it in terms of how it might widen their tent a little bit and to pull a nascent evangelical movement under their roof a little bit. So these guys were opportunists. I would make the argument, because I've read their stuff and I've listened to them, I would make the argument that they only use religion as a tool. So if it's in their schools, they're using it as a way to bring more people in, not necessarily as part of their ideology. Because their literature doesn't reference religion to a great extent, as much as you would think in a place like Mississippi. It's a good question. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much. My question, I kind of have a two-part question, talking about the history, again, around education. So I grew up, I went to a private school, and so in Oklahoma. I'm from Oklahoma, and so first question is, how did the Citizens Council, do you think, how did it influence other private schools across the nation, or did it? And then second part is, talking about the theme, resisting equality, do you think that private schools now, being racially integrated, do you think that they are still yet resisting a socioeconomic equality?
Wow, those are great questions. Let me answer the second question first. And I think this is more of a personal reflection than it is rooted in any historical evidence. We have understood now that we've gotten into the 21st century that integration in and of itself was not enough for us to do the change that we really want to see. And so in that way, I think even within the private school movement, if we talk about people of color in white-dominated spaces, all sorts of complexities begin to emerge that they couldn't have accounted for in the 1960s. And so to the first question, the council school movement itself was receiving funding from a group called the Pioneer Fund. The Pioneer Fund was a New York-based nonprofit that funded what I call racial biologists. So they were psychologists and they were MDs and they were researchers who felt like they had been kicked out of the academy because of their belief, what they believed was their reasoned belief, that there were natural biological differences that made one race better than another. The Pioneer Fund funded those researchers so they could continue to do their work when they lost their jobs at places like University of Virginia. The Pioneer Fund got onto the council in the early 60s, and they helped fund the private school movement in Mississippi. So their definition of education was an early version of that curated education, that this was a way to sort of keep that ideology alive, and to have scientists come in and talk about those things. The council then took their experiences with the early council schools, and they hosted meetings, these leadership conference, an annual leadership conference every year in the 60s, most of the 60s, into the 70s. And one of the themes that they had was how to start your own private school. And so they had influence in terms of bringing disaffected whites from all over the country into these leadership conferences and basically workshopping their way through how you do this, how you achieve nonprofit status, where you get your teachers from, what kind of spaces you might be able to use, that kind of thing. So their influence, again, it's sort of like, I know they're doing this, but I don't know how much influence it had on other places because I didn't follow the attendees. But they're both really good questions, and I think that this is the thing that I think is most profound to me about the council movement is that they left marks. I don't think we could ever account for how many marks they left, but they weren't a provincial organization. And so these leadership conferences were sort of sophisticated ways to instruct people on how to do as we do, how to get the success that we've had. Thank you.
I love this series. I love that we usually have more questions than we have time to handle during the hour. The good news is Stephanie is happy to stay, and I think for every book you buy, you'll answer a question. Is that?
Sure.
Copies of this fine book are available for sale over here. You can ask any question you want. Thank you all for coming. Help me thank Stephanie Rolph for this.